At first glance, Bitcoin mining difficulty sounds like a purely technical detail, something buried deep in code, relevant only to engineers and hardcore miners. But the truth is, mining difficulty sits at the very heart of what makes Bitcoin work at all. Without it, Bitcoin wouldn't just be inefficient or unstable, it would completely fall apart. To understand why, we need to step back and ask a more fundamental question. In a world where Bitcoin has no central authority, no company, no government, and no one in charge who decides how fast new Bitcoins are created. In traditional financial systems, this role is obvious. Central banks adjust interest rates, governments decide monetary policy, committees meet, vote, and intervene when something breaks. But Bitcoin was designed to exist without any of that. There is no meeting room, no emergency button, and no human manager watching over the system. Yet Bitcoin still needs rules, very strict rules. One of the most important of these rules is the block time. On average, a new block should be added to the blockchain every 10 minutes. Not 8, not 20, 10. This rhythm is not arbitrary. It controls how quickly new Bitcoins enter circulation, how predictable the supply is, and how secure the network remains over time. But here's the problem. The world Bitcoin lives in is not static. Computing power constantly changes. New miners join, old miners leave. Hardware becomes faster. Electricity prices fluctuate. Entire countries can suddenly ban mining. The total computational power of the network, known as the hash rate, can rise or fall dramatically in a matter of weeks. If Bitcoin did nothing to respond to these changes, the system would immediately drift out of balance. Imagine a version of Bitcoin with no mining difficulty adjustment. If a huge number of powerful miners suddenly joined the network, blocks would be found much faster than every 10 minutes. New Bitcoins would flood into existence far ahead of schedule. Confirmations would speed up, but security assumptions would break, and the carefully designed supply curve would be destroyed. Now imagine the opposite. If miners disappeared en masse, blocks could take hours or even days to be found. Transactions would get stuck. The network would feel frozen. Confidence would collapse. Bitcoin needed a way to automatically stabilize itself in both directions without relying on trust, coordination, or human judgment. This is where mining difficulty comes in. Mining difficulty is not a punishment. It is not an obstacle designed to frustrate miners. It is Bitcoin's way of anchoring itself to time in a chaotic, ever-changing environment. It is the mechanism that allows a decentralized network to keep a steady heartbeat. When Satoshi Nakamoto designed Bitcoin, this was one of the most elegant and underrated solutions in the entire system. Instead of trying to control miners, Bitcoin controls probability. Instead of reacting instantly, it reacts slowly and deliberately. And instead of trusting people, it trusts mathematics. At its core, Bitcoin mining is a race. Miners compete to find the next valid block by repeatedly guessing numbers and checking whether the result meets a specific condition. The more computing power you have, the more guesses you can make per second. But no matter how powerful you are, you cannot predict which guess will succeed. You can only increase your odds. Without difficulty adjustment, those odds would be completely dependent on how many miners are playing the game at any given moment. With difficulty adjustment, Bitcoin reshapes the game itself. It quietly changes the rules so that, on average, the network still finds one block every 10 minutes, no matter how crowded or how empty the mining landscape becomes. This is what makes Bitcoin feel almost alive. It doesn't panic when conditions change. It doesn't overreact. It observes, measures, and adapts. And this adaptation is not based on opinions or forecasts. It is based purely on what actually happened. How long did the last set of blocks take to be mined? That single question drives the entire adjustment mechanism. Mining difficulty is therefore not just a technical parameter. It is a form of embedded economic discipline. It forces miners to compete under fair and predictable conditions. It prevents sudden inflation. It protects the long-term issuance schedule. And most importantly, it ensures that no individual miner, no cartel, and no nation can easily overpower the system simply by throwing more machines at it. In a strange way, mining difficulty is Bitcoin's immune system. When the network grows stronger, difficulty rises to match it. When the network weakens, difficulty falls to keep it alive. The system doesn't need to know why changes happen. It only responds to the measurable outcome. This is why understanding how mining difficulty is calculated matters so much, because hidden inside that calculation is Bitcoin Coin's answer to one of the hardest problems in decentralized systems: how to remain stable without control. In the next part, we'll strip away the mystique and look closely at what mining difficulty actually measures. Not in abstract terms, but in concrete, mechanical reality. We'll explore hashes, targets, and probability and see how Bitcoin turns raw randomness into a reliable clock. And once you see that, the rest of the system starts to make a lot more sense. To really understand how Bitcoin mining difficulty is calculated, we first have to clear away one very common misunderstanding. Mining difficulty is not a measure of how powerful miners are. It does not describe machines, electricity, or hardware efficiency. Instead, it describes how hard it is, on average, to find a valid block. That distinction matters because Bitcoin doesn't see miners. It only sees results. At the deepest level, Bitcoin mining is nothing more than repeated hashing. A hash is the output of a cryptographic function, specifically SHA-256, which takes an input and produces a fixed-length string of seemingly random characters. No matter how small the change in the input, the output looks completely different. And crucially, there is no shortcut. The only way to get a different hash is to try again. Miners take the data of a candidate block and keep modifying a small piece of it, usually a number called a nonce. Every change produces a new hash. Most of the time, that hash is useless. It doesn't meet Bitcoin's requirement. So the miner tries again and again and again. This is where probability enters the picture. Bitcoin defines a condition that a block hash must satisfy in order to be accepted by the network. That condition is simple to state, but extremely hard to meet. The hash must be numerically smaller than a certain value. This value is known as the target. Think of the target as an invisible line on a vast number scale. All possible hashes are spread evenly across that scale. Most hashes fall above the line. Only a tiny fraction fall below it. When a miner happens to produce one of those rare hashes, the block is valid. Mining difficulty is simply a way of expressing how small that target is. When the target is large, many hashes qualify. Blocks are found quickly, and mining is easy. When the target is small, very few hashes qualify. Blocks are found slowly, and mining is hard. Difficulty doesn't change how hashing works. It changes how picky Bitcoin is about which hashes it will accept. What makes this elegant is that hashing itself remains perfectly random. Miners are not solving puzzles in the traditional sense. They are playing a massive lottery where each hash is a ticket. Difficulty controls how many winning tickets exist. This also explains why mining is fundamentally unpredictable in the short term. Even with enormous computing power, there is no guarantee about when the next valid hash will appear. You can calculate averages, but you cannot predict outcomes. One miner might find 2 blocks in an hour, another might find none for weeks. Over time, probabilities smooth out, but randomness never disappears. Bitcoin embraces this randomness rather than fighting it. To make difficulty measurable and comparable, Bitcoin defines a reference point called difficulty 1. This corresponds to the original target used in the very first blocks mined by Satoshi Nakamoto. Every other difficulty value is expressed as a multiple of that baseline. So when you hear that the current mining difficulty is, for example, 80 trillion, what that really means is that finding a valid block is 80 trillion times harder than it was at difficulty 1. Not harder for a specific miner, but harder in terms of probability across the entire network. The network does not ask how many hashes miners are performing per second. It does not ask how much energy they are consuming. It only observes how often valid blocks appear. Difficulty is adjusted until the math lines up with the desired outcome. 1 block every 10 minutes, on average. This framing reveals something subtle but profound. Bitcoin never measures hash rate directly. Hash rate is inferred. It is backed out from observed behavior. If blocks are coming in too fast, the network concludes that effective hashing power must be higher than expected. If blocks are coming in too slow, the opposite must be true. Difficulty is therefore not a command. It is a response. And this response works because of how tightly probability, hashing, and time are linked. If you make the target twice as hard to hit, you double the expected number of hashes needed to find a block. If you make it 10 times harder, you multiply the expected work by 10. This linear relationship is what allows Bitcoin to scale difficulty smoothly across vast changes in computing power. It's also what makes attacks so expensive. To overpower the network, an attacker doesn't just need faster machines. They need to consistently outpace the combined probability-weighted hashing power of honest miners. And as soon as they do, difficulty will eventually rise to meet them. The system pushes back, not by force, but by math. Seen this way, mining difficulty is not an arbitrary number. It is a living variable that reflects the balance between time, randomness, and collective effort. It is Bitcoin's way of translating raw computational chaos into a predictable rhythm. In the next part, we'll zoom out and look at how Bitcoin actually performs this adjustment in practice. We'll follow the 2016 block cycle, see how time is measured, and understand why Bitcoin adjusts slowly instead of instantly. That delay is not a flaw. It's one of the reasons the system has survived for so long. If part 2 explained what mining difficulty represents, this part is about how Bitcoin actually changes it. And this is where Bitcoin starts to feel less like software and more like a self-regulating organism. Bitcoin does not adjust difficulty continuously. It does not react to every fluctuation in hash rate. Instead, it waits. It observes, and only after a fixed interval does it make a single, decisive adjustment. That interval is 2016 blocks. Why 2016? Because if blocks are found every 10 minutes, 2016 blocks should take exactly 2 weeks. 14 days becomes Bitcoin's reference window. It's long enough to smooth out randomness, but short enough to respond to real structural changes in the network. At the end of each 2016 block period, every full node on the network performs the same simple calculation. No coordination, no voting, no discussion, just math. The node looks at 2 timestamps, the timestamp of the first block in the period and the timestamp of the last block. It measures how much real time passed while those 2016 blocks were mined. Then it compares that to the ideal time of 2 weeks. If the blocks were mined faster than expected, difficulty goes up. If they were mined slower than expected, difficulty goes down. That's it. There is no analysis of why this happened. Bitcoin does not care whether miners upgraded their machines, electricity got cheaper, or a new country entered the mining race. The protocol only cares about outcomes. Time in versus blocks out. The adjustment itself works by changing the target value. If blocks came in too quickly, the target is lowered, meaning fewer hashes qualify as valid. If blocks came in too slowly, the target is raised, making valid hashes easier to find. Difficulty, as we discussed earlier, is just a human-friendly way of expressing how extreme that target is compared to the original baseline. But there's an important safety feature built into this process. Bitcoin does not allow difficulty to change without limits. In a single adjustment, difficulty can only increase or decrease by a factor of 4. That means it can at most quadruple or drop to 1/4 of its previous value. This constraint exists to protect the network from shock. Imagine if half the world's miners disappeared overnight and difficulty instantly dropped to match. Blocks would flood in, making attacks easier. Now imagine the opposite, a sudden explosion of mining power causing difficulty to skyrocket instantly, potentially pushing smaller miners out and destabilizing the network. By limiting the adjustment range, Bitcoin forces itself to adapt gradually. Even extreme events are absorbed over multiple cycles, not in a single violent swing. History has given us real-world examples of why this matters. When China banned industrial Bitcoin mining in 2021, a massive portion of the network's hash rate vanished in a matter of weeks. Blocks slowed down dramatically. Transactions backed up. The system looked stressed, but it didn't break. At the next difficulty adjustment, difficulty dropped sharply. Then it dropped again in the following cycle. Block times returned to normal. Mining redistributed globally. Bitcoin healed itself without coordination, bailouts, or emergency patches. This is the power of delayed, rule-based response. Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment doesn't try to be smart. It tries to be consistent. And in decentralized systems, consistency beats cleverness every time. There is also something quietly profound about how this mechanism treats time. Bitcoin does not trust wall clock time directly. Block timestamps are provided by miners, and they can be manipulated within limits. But because the adjustment window is so long, and because thousands of independent miners are involved, individual lies average out. The network relies on collective behavior rather than individual honesty. Over 2016 blocks, truth emerges statistically. This design choice reveals a deeper philosophy. Bitcoin does not attempt to eliminate uncertainty. It builds systems that function in spite of it. Randomness, dishonesty, and volatility are assumed, not ignored. Difficulty adjustment works not because miners are well behaved, but because incentives and probability align over time. And that time element is critical. By waiting 2 weeks between adjustments, Bitcoin avoids feedback loops that could otherwise destabilize the system. Instant reactions amplify noise. Slow reactions filter it out. What looks inefficient on the surface is actually a form of robustness. Difficulty adjustment is Bitcoin's way of saying, I will not chase every shadow. I will move when the signal is clear. In the final part, we'll step back and look at what this mechanism means beyond block times and hash rates. We'll explore why mining difficulty is central to Bitcoin's security, its monetary integrity, and its long-term survival as a form of money that no one controls and no one can easily break. By now, it should be clear that mining difficulty is not just a background parameter quietly ticking away in the Bitcoin protocol. It is one of the core forces that gives Bitcoin its unique character. But to really appreciate its significance, we have to zoom out one last time and look at what difficulty does for Bitcoin as a monetary system, not just as a network of computers. At a fundamental level, mining difficulty is what anchors Bitcoin to reality. Bitcoin is digital, borderless, and abstract, but it is not weightless. Every block requires real-world energy. Every adjustment in difficulty reflects a real change in the cost of securing the network. This connection between computation, energy, and time is what prevents Bitcoin from becoming just another easily manipulated digital ledger. Difficulty acts like gravity. It doesn't stop movement, but it gives movement direction and cost. When difficulty rises, it means more work is required to produce the same outcome. That work is not symbolic. It is measured in electricity consumed, hardware deployed, and capital risked. This is why Bitcoin's security grows alongside its value. As the incentive to attack the network increases, so does the cost of doing so. This is not enforced by law or reputation. It is enforced by physics. The difficulty adjustment mechanism ensures that no matter how attractive Bitcoin becomes, the effort required to rewrite its history scales with that attractiveness. An attacker cannot simply wait for a quiet moment and strike cheaply. They must outcompete the entire network, not just once, but continuously, while the system adapts against them. This is also why Bitcoin's issuance schedule has remained so resilient. New Bitcoins are minted as block rewards, but those rewards are tied to block production, not calendar dates. Difficulty is what keeps that production on schedule. Without it, the famous supply curve, with its halvings and long-term scarcity, would be meaningless. Too many miners would accelerate issuance. Too few would stall it. Difficulty ensures that Bitcoin's monetary policy is not just written in code, but enforced by cost. There is a deeper implication here that often goes unnoticed. Traditional monetary systems rely on discretion. Someone must decide when to tighten or loosen policy. Someone must choose between competing priorities. Bitcoin removes that choice entirely. It replaces discretion with inevitability. Difficulty does not ask what is fair. It does not care what is convenient. It responds only to what happened. This is why Bitcoin feels so different from any form of money that came before it. Trust is not placed in people or institutions, but in processes that cannot easily be bent. Mining difficulty is one of the clearest examples of this philosophy in action. It also explains why Bitcoin can survive events that would cripple centralized systems. When miners leave, difficulty drops. When miners arrive, difficulty rises. No emergency meeting is called. No narrative is spun. The system adjusts and moves on. This neutrality is unsettling to those used to human control, but it is precisely what gives Bitcoin its resilience. From a long-term perspective, difficulty adjustment turns Bitcoin into a self-balancing organism. It cannot grow too fast without increasing the effort required to sustain that growth. It cannot shrink without lowering the barrier to participation. In both cases, it pulls itself back toward equilibrium. This has profound implications for decentralization. As difficulty increases, inefficient miners are forced out. As difficulty decreases, new miners can enter. Over time, This creates a constantly shifting landscape where no single actor can easily dominate forever. Power must be continuously earned, not simply held. And because difficulty responds to the aggregate behavior of the network, not individual identities, it treats all participants the same. A miner in a warehouse full of machines is subject to the same probabilistic rules as someone running a small operation halfway across the world. Scale helps, but it never guarantees success. In the end, mining difficulty is not about making mining hard. It is about making Bitcoin honest. Honest about time, honest about cost, honest about scarcity. It ensures that every Bitcoin in existence represents a measurable amount of work that could not be faked, rushed, or skipped. That work is what gives Bitcoin its credibility as a system that does not need permission to function. When people say Bitcoin is governed by math, this is what they mean. Not abstract equations, but mechanisms like difficulty adjustment that quietly enforce fairness, stability, and security, block after block, year after year. And the remarkable thing is that once this mechanism was set in motion, it no longer needed its creator. It doesn't ask for guidance. It doesn't evolve through debate. It simply continues to measure, adjust, and persist. In a world where almost everything is managed, negotiated, and manipulated, Bitcoin's mining difficulty stands as a rare example of a rule that no one can override. And that might be its greatest strength.